Administering network printer issues. If you have much field experience, you'll know, as I'm about to say, that printing in general is one of the core services that your users will rely upon, probably second only to their email communications. In my experience as a systems engineer and a desktop support technician, I've found that the biggest complaints I receive from users are A, if they have an outage with regard to their email, or B, if they have an outage and cannot print their documents. In particular, I worked as a director of technology for a private high school in Nashville, Tennessee, so you can imagine how deeply reliant not only the faculty but the students were on those printers. Consequently, in this nugget, we're going to start with looking at the Windows 7 print process and how that's evolved since previous versions of Windows. We'll examine troubleshooting methodologies for resolving hardware and printer failure. We'll look at how to install and deploy printers in Windows 7 and on Windows Server 2008 R2. Once again, not only to cover our 7685 objectives, but also to give you a well-rounded picture of the network printing schemata. It's crucial that we look at how to deploy these printers on the server side, as well as handling local printing on an individual Windows 7 box. Microsoft has certainly made the process of setting up printers a lot easier than they have in earlier versions of Windows desktop OSs. And we'll conclude by looking at driver and network issues specifically. Without any further ado, let's get started. Troubleshooting hardware and printer failure. The first thing we need to understand, and you've probably been there, done that, bought the proverbial t-shirt and coffee cup with this, but I think it bears repeating, and that is the distinction between a print device and a printer. Now, this is a Microsoft-centric terminology really, but it's crucial that we understand the distinction. In Microsoft nomenclature, and what you'll see on your exams, are references to print devices. This represents the actual physical hardware manifestation of the printer or multifunction device, whatever it is that you're supporting that does print. The printer in Microsoft parlance refers to the software interface, which includes typically, of course, the driver, as well as any additional management metadata associated with that print queue. Keep that distinction in mind as we move forward. In terms of troubleshooting print devices, the hardware, you shouldn't expect to see much or anything on this on your 7685 exam, simply because this is a Microsoft-centric certification, and as such, we're going to be asked for our expertise in Windows software troubleshooting and hardware as it relates to Windows, not, for instance, Dell, Canon, Hewlett-Packard, Xerox print devices. Nonetheless, in the name of completeness, the most common hardware printer problems you're likely to see as a working desktop tech are things like paper jams, dirty rollers and printer innards, and possibly a network interface card failure on that machine, or some other network-related problem that brings in troubleshooting skills we talked about earlier in the course, using ping, checking physical media, tracing the network path from the print device to the telco closet to your core, and so on and so forth. Specifically for the exam, like I said, we need to look at how Windows interacts with your print devices. Probably the most common problem I've seen with Windows-based print servers is the issue of the spooler getting stuck. Now, in a nutshell, the print spooler, if you're not familiar with this, is simply a folder on your system's hard drive. Now, a print server in this context can be a machine running a dedicated Windows Server version, such as in this case, in the upcoming demo, we'll be looking at Windows Server 2008 R2, the latest and greatest edition of Windows Server. However, Windows 7 machines as domain workstations or home group/workgroup workstations can also share out a printer to other users on the network if you're allowing that. So understand the term print server is fairly generic, and actually there's a third one. Many print devices, especially Hewlett-Packard and Xerox and other big-name enterprise manufacturers, will sell workgroup printers that have not only an integrated NIC but also an integrated print server component, so you can actually manage security on that print queue, put it out on the network without relying upon an external machine. Now again, we have to rein in our discussion. The issue of network printing is a broad one for sure. In this case, we're dealing with two scenarios, one where we have a dedicated print server running a Windows Server OS, and the other where we have a Windows 7 workstation that has a locally attached printer. Now, getting back to our discussion of the spooler is a folder that contains page images from print jobs. Now, on a central print server, say a Windows Server 2008 box, you can expect that that print spooler will periodically get pretty large, especially if the print server is servicing more than one print device and user requests are coming in, especially during peak periods from over the network. Now, we don't need to get too jiggy with the technical details. One advance in print spooler technology and spooling technology in general in Windows 7 and Server 08 R2 is this migration from the GDI, or Graphical Device Interface method, which has been the printing modality since the earliest versions of Windows, versus what Microsoft calls the XML paper specification, or XPS. In a nutshell, XPS is Microsoft's answer to Adobe's portable document format, or PDF. How far Microsoft will actually get with this as a document format remains to be seen though. But the baseline message is the old school GDI would print your document as separate enhanced metafile EMF, basically image files, and they would either spool to the local hard drive and then print directly to your locally attached printer, or in a workgroup domain situation, the client clicks File Print and the document actually spools across the network to the spooler folder on the server. That's a key difference between print server communications and just a workgroup machine printing locally to their own local printer. XPS has some technical advantages: speed, performance, what you see is what you get printing, etc. Just know about this migration from GDI to XPS printing. We'll look at some of those options in the upcoming demo as well. Finally, with troubleshooting hardware and printer failure, do you have the correct drivers installed on your print server? We're going to see, and this has been a feature of Windows Server history since Windows NT, we can store not only drivers for the current operating system, but also down-level operating systems. In other words, earlier versions of Windows that may not be compatible. We have the Vista Windows 7, perhaps XP driver, and then we might have some 9X clients, I hope not, but it's possible, that we need to service. Unfortunately, Microsoft is pretty Microsoft-centric as far as hosting additional print drivers on the print server. For non-Microsoft OSs, you're out of luck. You're going to have to just install the driver manually. But as long as your machines on the network are primarily Windows, you can cover, and especially now in 2010, for instance, 64-bit and 32-bit versions of print drivers to make those transparently available on your network. As a print manager, we also have a new feature in Server 08 R2 called driver isolation. We'll talk more about that momentarily. Windows 7 printing enhancements. This whiteboard contains some of the new and/or enhanced features in Windows 7 with regard to the printing subsystem. As I mentioned in the previous whiteboard, we have this XML paper specification. The reason why I'm calling this out again is that in Windows 7 you'll see an XPS Writer virtual printer, and I want to make sure you understand what that is so you can explain it to your users. The virtual printer is similar to the Adobe PDF virtual printer if you've ever used the full version of Adobe Acrobat. The idea is the user can open their application, and instead of printing to a real live piece of hardware, they can send their print job to the XPS virtual printer and you wind up with XPS output. Internet Explorer version 8 contains a built-in XPS viewer, so if you're wondering, do I need a separate client-side application? No, you don't, as long as you have a recent version of IE. Another neat trend that we see in Windows 7 printing is this notion of the device stage. Now, again, if you have experience in the industry, you know that dollars to donuts, if you have a choice of installing a print driver, let me draw my little printer, either from, say, the manufacturer's CD, from the Windows CD, or the vendor's own website, which of those options are you going to want to go for? Now, first of all, when I said Windows CD, I meant DVD. And when you do an installation of Windows 7, those drivers are dumped to the hard drive. So you have a local driver store of signed drivers for a number, hundreds and hundreds of common print devices. The idea with a local driver store, of course, is that Joe end user or Jane end user can plug in their, say, USB local printer, and they don't have to do anything. It's literally a plug-and-play situation. Advantages of that are you're going to get a signed driver that's definitely passed Windows logo testing. Disadvantage of that is that you're, dollars to donuts again, not going to get the print features, the print management, the bidirectional communication. If this, again, were a local printer with USB connectivity, let's say, the user would not be able to check the ink cartridge status. If there's a paper jam, the printer wouldn't be able to notify the user. So you know that as a professional, you'll always want to go at the very least with the manufacturer's packaged driver software. And best practice of all is to go out onto the web and get the very latest version of that driver and management software from the vendor. Microsoft knows this. So what they have is a feature called Device Stage that you can enable in Windows 7 that will go out onto the internet, hook up with the vendor's website, and display a realistic icon or image of the device, which is nice as far as a user being able to tell at a glance which printer is which, but also you're transparently plugged into the vendor in terms of the device driver and the management software. Along those lines, we have the ability to plug our printers, so to speak, into Windows Update. In Windows 7, you can do printer driver installation or upgrade through Windows Update. Obviously, as a domain administrator, you want to control that. You don't just want different driver versions willy-nilly throughout your domain. If you've ever heard of Windows Software Update Service, or WSUS, also called Windows Server Update Service, this is where you can set up your own local Windows Update server and therefore approve or reject these things, these drivers, these packages coming from Microsoft. Yet another feature that's kind of nifty in Windows 7 printing is location-based printing. Earlier in the course when we talked about network location profiles, I described those as being separate sets of Windows firewall rules that are applied based on the IP address and network connection that's active on that box. So the best candidate for something like location-based printing, which is the same idea. You have a default printer when you're at work, and you have a default printer when you're at home, and you use a corporate laptop for your main computer, let's say. Location-based printing is that same idea. Based on your network location, Windows will transparently set the appropriate printer as your default, which is a really nice convenience when you think about it, especially with end users who are, shall we say, technically challenged. Now then, printer driver isolation. This is a Windows Server 2008 R2 only feature. And by the way, just in case you don't know what R2 is, R2 stands for Release 2. Basically, the way Windows patches or updates their software, it goes from the most granular or smallest, which is the hotfix. This is a fix or a patch to a specific vulnerability, bug, or problem with Windows software. Then every year, couple of years, Microsoft rolls all of the previous hotfixes together for that product since it went gold or released to manufacturing. Normally, they add a few features in, and they call that a service pack. At an even more meta level, Microsoft can take not only service packs and integrate them with the product, but then eventually, if enough new functionality and technology comes along, they'll issue a separate release of the software. They started this with Windows Server 2003. In fact, to our point, the print management, Microsoft Management Console Snap-in, was introduced originally with Windows Server 2003 R2. Of course, we have print management in Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 by default, but Microsoft continues to add features and benefits to it. Alright, so we've talked about location-based printing. I've mentioned Print Management Console, which is such an improvement over how print management was done prior to Windows Server 2003 R2. Prior to that, you basically just had a printers and faxes folder on your print server, just like you would on any other machine in the domain, and there was not a centralized interface for managing those print queues. If you haven't used the Printer Management Console yet, you're in for a great treat. Coming back to this bullet point here, what is printer driver isolation? Well, this feature, again, R2 is where it was introduced, is similar to the notion of the IIS, or Internet Information Services, connection pool. If you've ever heard of an application pool or a connection pool as it's called, it's a way to isolate processes from each other so that that they don't hose each other up. For instance, you might have a Windows Server 2008 R2 print server that hosts 3 print queues, but you find that one of those queues, the driver of which is a little bit unstable. Sometimes it freezes up, and when that happens by default, when you're in what's called shared mode, you'll wind up blocking up the entire spool folder for the whole server. It's actually an unfortunate relic of, if you go back before Windows 95, before you had the preemptive multitasking, you had what's called cooperative multitasking with, say, Windows 3.1, where if you had multiple applications running, if one crashed, it tended to dump all of your applications. So finally, with printer driver isolation, you as an administrator can mark a driver to run in an isolated memory space, such that if that driver goes south, it'll freeze its associated print queue or queues, but the other ones should be fine, and the spool folder on the server should also be fine. To circle back on a concept I mentioned a couple whiteboard slides ago, never underestimate the power of server management and troubleshooting problems that might be as simple as that the client downloaded or attempted to download a bad driver from the server. Especially nowadays, where many shops are in a mixed 64-bit, 32-bit environment, it's crucial that you don't overlook that notion of loading the alternate drivers on the print server. One feature that Microsoft has called for a long time, point and print, easy way to deploy printers from the client side simply using drag and drop. There's actually a few different ways in Windows 7 to add a print queue. We'll review those in the upcoming demo. But anytime the client does attempt to hook up to a print queue on a server, of course that driver needs to come down from the server to the client. So we want to make sure that the driver is appropriate for the Windows client OS, as well as it matches the processor architecture. Incidentally, Windows Server 2008 R2 is a 64-bit only operating system. More and more nowadays, Microsoft is migrating their server and enterprise software to 64-bit only. You could have various, if you want to pop on your tinfoil hat and start talking conspiracy theories, you might think, how much is Microsoft tied in with hardware manufacturers, what are called OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, and is trying to corral customers down a particular path? Well, we don't need to worry about that for the 7685 exam, so I'll just leave it at that and we'll continue. We already spoke about print driver isolation, but what we have not spoke about yet, or should I say spoken about yet to use correct English, is how do we deploy these print queues from a central location and manage them? Now, it used to be before the print management console came to be in Server 03 R2, as I mentioned, you had just a single printers and faxes folder, and you would share out the queues separately as UNC print queues. In other words, whack server name, whack queue name. And that still exists, of course, but we have some neat enhancements. We can list or publish our print queues in Active Directory domain services in Windows Server 2008, which, as you'll see in the demo, makes it super easy for users to find print queues. Historically, when you do it the old Server 03 way, it is pretty confusing, to say the least, on the client side to find the appropriate print queue. Even more automated with the print management console, we can use group policy to deploy print queues. This gives us super granular control over which print queues are attached to which computers in our environment. Of course, practically speaking, if somebody works on the 3rd floor of your office building, you don't want to deploy a print queue from the 1st floor. Again, back in the bad old days, you might deploy, for instance, a logon script, an old DOS shell script that contained net use commands that mapped one or more various print queues to your users. And your users might log into, say, their Windows XP desktop, open their printers and faxes folder, and see 24 print queues. It reminds me of the old Abbott and Costello sketch, Who's on First? Now, fortunately, with group policy, we can, as I said, deploy only print queues that we want those user populations to see. That's great stuff, and certainly makes managing network issues and driver issues with printing so much easier. Finally, never underestimate the power of Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, SMTP notifications. Oftentimes, printers like the Hewlett-Packard series in particular that have their own integrated print server functionality, you can put in an SMTP email address and point to an SMTP server, and that printer will automatically send email messages out based on predefined conditions. Low on paper, this tray is out, low on toner, out of toner, these kinds of things. paper jam. We can also configure email notifications in the print management console if we want to go about it that way. Either way, this keeps us as IT support staff on the ball because we want to be proactive, not reactive in our management. Wouldn't you agree? Reactive is an angry user call saying that the printer's on the fritz. Proactive means you receive a notification saying that the toner's out and you get over there and replace the toner cartridge before anybody notices. That's the best case scenario. In our demo, very simply, we're going to look at printing, both local printing, where the print device is physically tethered to the host machine, typically with a universal serial bus or USB connection, as well as network printing, which is where the client is connecting to the print server. The print server is then managing the print device. We'll look at how both of these schemes work in Windows 7 as well as Server 2008, and by the end of the process, we will have converted all the theory we picked up in the last several minutes into practical knowledge and understanding. Let's get going. Okay, let's get this party started. We're on WinNugget, domain member Windows 7 Ultimate Edition workstation, and we're working with printing and the troubleshooting thereof. To begin, we'll open Party Central for printing in Windows 7 Client, and that is from the Start menu, we can come on over to Devices and Printers. What you should see, first of all, some differences between Windows 7 and previous versions of Windows is, of course, the ultra-large detailed icons, although they're not quite as detailed as they can get if we enable the device stage feature. Now you'll notice we have devices which refer to your main hardware devices. These could be infrared or USB items. By default, I just have an entry for my monitor and the actual PC itself. Let me collapse this because we don't really need that in this nugget. Printers and faxes is where we've got stuff going on. And the two items you'll see in here by default in Windows 7 are, as previously discussed, the Microsoft XML paper specification, XPS document writer, and a fax driver. In the background, I've installed a local printer, a Canon Inkjet MP970. Now, when you've come into devices and printers, out of the box here like you're seeing on a local box, you see the information bar. It says Windows can display enhanced device icons and information from the internet. Click here to change. And notice that this is a UAC protected item, and then there's a helpful what happens if I change this. And it gives you basically a description of the device stage business. Fact that you wind up not only with a prettier icon, but also a more robust interface directly from the hardware vendor. Now, to look at the properties of a local or network printer, again, this is a local printer, we can right-click, and let's just spend a moment looking at the shortcut menu and see a little bit how it's evolved since previous versions of Windows. You notice that we have See What's Printing, which is just a shortcut to open the print queue, and the actual printer queue in Windows 7 Client is identical to the print queue that's been around for a long time, even as far back as Windows XP. So if you're familiar with pausing a print queue, canceling all documents, in other words, purging the queue, setting a print queue for offline use when you're disconnected from the network, or pause, resume, restart, cancel individual documents in the queue. If you're familiar with doing that in earlier versions of Windows, well, none of that has changed in Windows 7. If we right-click, we can also troubleshoot, and this is certainly something you'll want to try both for local as well as remote printers on the client machine. This brings up that whole network diagnostics framework that we've talked about earlier in the course, and it's nice because you notice it's saying spooler service errors. Here it's looking at printer-specific possible problems. Explore additional options, which takes us into the troubleshooting additional information control panel, or that's it. Of course, this printer is functional, so the troubleshooter hasn't found anything the matter. Now, if we right-click and come down to Properties, we see the Properties sheet for the print queue. Doesn't look particularly useful here. It's just giving us metadata and information on the hardware, the underlying hardware. If we right-click and go to Printing Preferences, here we start to get a little bit more granular in our management of the printer, although still not full-blown administration. Now, it looks like Canon did a really good job in providing Microsoft with signed drivers that also provide some rich maintenance features as well. Check this out. Now, the specific preference pages that you'll get for these printers, these software printers in Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008, are going to be dependent upon what the manufacturer has given Microsoft if we're using the Microsoft driver store as our driver source. But as I said, this Canon inkjet printer, we can do a lot of really cool management things using the driver that comes directly with Windows. Pretty darn cool. Page setup, main, all that's pretty standard fare. Double-clicking the printer opens the print queue. And then finally, we have printer properties, which is where we want to go as printer administrators to look at some of the real meat and potatoes. Of course, printing a test page is a standby action for troubleshooting a printer. The sharing tab, now this is what it looks like on Windows 7. By default, you install a local printer. You own that printer, but it's not shared. The UAC shield here allows us to change the sharing options, publish the printer, possibly even list the printer in Active Directory to make it easier for other folks in your forest domain in particular to locate that printer. That's pretty cool. I'm going to disable sharing because I am on a local workstation here. Ports is where you can specify ports. Printer pooling is a server-only feature where you would have multiple print devices being advertised as a single logical printer. It's a way to increase print output. You'll notice here that this printer is sitting on LPT1, which is super old school parallel port. Of course, in the real world, you'd be using a USB interface, and as soon as you plug the printer in, it'll just dynamically show up here in your printers and faxes wizard. The advanced page allows you to set availability for the printer. By default, it's available whenever the host PC is on. We can also change print spooling options. The default is to start printing immediately. This means that as soon as the first page image hits the local print spooler, the printer actually starts processing the job. For large documents, just so you don't hose up or hang up a print queue for undue amounts of time, you might want to start printing after the last page is spooled. That'll get control back to other users who are attempting to access that printer. Looking at security settings here, what I want you to know and remember, might be review for you, is that print permissions when you are sharing a print queue are pretty straightforward. Basically, the print permission is your ordinary base level permission for folks. They'll be able to submit and manage their own print jobs. The difference between manage this printer and manage documents is this. If you have managed documents, then you can cancel other people's print jobs, including your own, pause the entire queue, and do that kind of document management of that queue. Manage this printer allows you to actually come into this properties page and change settings. And then we've seen the maintenance tab. So that's the basic property sheet outlay when a printer appears in Windows 7. Of course, the next question is how can we add additional printers to the machine? You'll notice here on the information bar, you can add a device, a wireless or network device to the computer, or we can add a printer. The Add Printer Wizard has taken a dramatic step forward in usability, in my opinion, in Windows 7. You can add a local printer if it's not USB. In fact, it says that here. If I step back, actually let me cancel and restart it. Use this option only if you do not have a USB printer, because of course Windows will automatically install a local USB printer. More common though is as an administrator or desktop support tech, you'll want to hook up a client or a user. The client's the computer, the user is the human. Let's keep that straight. You want to hook them up with a network-based print device. That's why we'll choose the second option, to add a network, wireless, or Bluetooth printer. Now check this out. This is awesome. As long as you in Active Directory have listed that print queue in Active Directory, you'll find that it shows up in this list. So there's no searching through potentially dozens of print queues to find the correct print one. I specifically created this HP LaserJet 4250 on my domain controller, DC Nugget 2, that also doubles as a print server, and I added the address metadata second floor IT office. So the idea here, even if I have a bunch of printers listed in Active Directory, I can do sorts as well as look at the address metadata and then proceed with the installation. Now the way this point and print works is that we, for instance, can instruct the user or us as a DST can open a run prompt or go through the network control panel. Here I'm just going to do / DC Nugget 2 to connect directly to the root ground floor sharing on that server. And you'll notice that print queue issues that are shared off of that computer show up in the share list. So to install the 4250 on my local machine, I can right-click and select Connect, and this is going to locate the appropriate driver on the server and attempt to finish the installation. And sure enough, there it is. There's our HP LaserJet 4250 on DC Nugget 2. To manually specify a new default printer is just as easy as right-clicking the appropriate printer and selecting Set as Default Printer. Now, because my WinNugget machine is connected to only one network and not more than one network, we're not seeing an additional option up here. Remember I mentioned location-based printing? As long as you have at least 2 network locations configured on your machine, there's an extra button here called Manage Default Printers, and this is where you can specify which printer should be the default based on a particular network location. Wanted to make sure we cover that. I also want to cover making property changes to a client-based network-sourced printer like this HP LaserJet 4250 on DC Nugget 2. I can right-click and come into Printing Preferences and make changes just for me, the currently logged-on user, for this box. Need to understand that when the client makes changes to queue settings like paper quality, tray specification, these preferences are being changed only for that user, not for everyone globally. Therefore, to review, we looked at getting into the Devices and Printers area. We saw that we can add a network printer by stepping through the wizard and looking at devices that are published in Active Directory. We can use Point and Print by going through the Network Control Panel using a Universal Naming Convention path, right-clicking and selecting Connect to use the Point and Print functionality. To delete a print queue, we can just right-click, select Remove Device, which I'll do now. Now we're back to 3. I think we've covered the basic printer options on the client side. Now let's mosey on over to our Windows Server 2008 R2 machine and look at server-side configuration and troubleshooting. Here we are on DC Nugget 2. This is a domain controller for another domain I've created called, my imagination is failing as you can tell, Nugget Lab 2. Now you'll notice by looking at the taskbar the similarity we have between Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows 7. It's the same idea. Whereas Windows Server 2003 is an analog to Windows XP, Windows Server 2008 R2 is directly analogous to Windows 7. Now, first, before I open up the administrative tools and dive into the print management console, you should know that in order to set up a Windows Server 2008 based print server, we have to install the appropriate role. And in Server Manager, you'll note that I have installed the Print and Document Services role. You can right-click, select Add Roles, and this is where you would select it. Of course, it's already installed on this box. Once you've done that, you can manage the Print Management console directly from within Server Manager, or for a cleaner interface, you can open up Administrative Tools, Print Management. And again, you're in for a treat if you haven't seen this before. It's just such a great way to manage printers in a central location, and even more so, and this was a big problem with the original Windows Server 2003 product, what if you had more than one print server in your domain? It was awfully difficult to figure out who's on first in terms of which print queues are on which servers. You'll note here we can load in all of our print servers theoretically and manage them all within a single location. You can even create filters or view filters, which kind of reminds me of what we saw with the event viewer. You can add new filters based on printer metadata and or driver metadata by right-clicking and selecting the appropriate option from the shortcut menu. But check this out. You can look at printers with active jobs, printers that are in a not ready state. Those are the built-in default filters. And then we have all drivers and all printers that give you nice clean views of, well, printers and drivers respectively. Then we come down into the print servers node and we have our local machine DC Nugget 2. In the drivers area we have a listing of all of our drivers. You'll notice that I have 3, the XPS document writer, no surprise there, OfficeJet 7200, and HP LaserJet 4200. Now you probably know that sometimes you can use the same driver for multiple models. In fact, you see it says 7200 series, which informs us of this. Same with the 4200, 4300. There are several different variants of those product families. You'll notice also on this machine, which of course is 64-bit, that's a requirement of Server 08 R2, our environment is x64. It tells us driver isolation is shared for those. Now if we want to change change that, we can right-click, go to Set Driver Isolation, Isolated, to make sure that a failure in this driver is not going to affect any other queues on the server. We also see version metadata, which is awfully helpful. If we look at the properties of a driver, you can see the specific files included in that package. Forms is where you can customize, or just basically see, I should say, all of your forms and tray options for your printers. Some are built in, some come along for the ride when you install a printer. You can do a quick sort based on the column headings. Ports gives you a listing of what ports you have available, physical ports on the server, and then you've noticed that I've created 2 TCP/IP ports. You can right-click the ports option and go to Manage Ports to add, delete, and configure those ports if you want to. Alternatively, you can create a TCP/IP port using, this is an old school dialog box. You can just step through that dialog to create just the network pipe that leads to a network-based printer. However, the best practice, in my opinion, is to come to the Printers node, right-click, choose Add Printer, and if you specify TCP/IP or Web Services Printer, you can just specify, is it a TCP/IP device or are you doing internet printing? I'm going to do TCP/IP in this case. Give it the IP address 10.zip.zip.222. Port name defaults to the IP address. You can actually auto-detect the driver because Windows will go out and hit this IP address and attempt to pick up the device based on what it finds on the other end of that socket. Next, we specify the device type if the device is not found. Now, if it is found, best case, you don't have to worry about this. I'm going to specify the common HP Jet Direct network interface card. Again, we're not able to detect this because it's just fictional. I'm using it in the example. I already have a driver on the computer that we can reuse, or we can install a new driver. I'm going to just reuse this guy, advertise it under a new name, HP 4200 laser. I'm going to copy and paste that into the share name, make sure there's no spaces. Location, 3rd floor, accounting office. And there we go. And we can print a test page and or add another printer, which I won't do in this case. So now we have 4 printers ready to be deployed. Now how do you deploy these pups? Well, one thing we can do is right-click and choose List in Directory. That's specifically how you make the printer available in Active Directory domain service, and then it's easier for the user to find that when they go through the Add Printer wizard in Windows 7. The other way to go is to right-click the printer and choose Deploy with Group Policy. This is definitely the preferred way to go here. Now it gives us the printer name. This is the Universal Naming Convention path, and then it specifies where is our group policy object. Now I only have one. I can create a new one if I want, but by default I just have the default domain, and that's actually where I'm going to deploy this. Deploy this printer to the following. We're going to do this per user or per machine. Well, I'm going to say it's per machine. Click Add, and now we have this printer being deployed in the GPO, the default domain policy GPO, and it's per machine. So if it's a shared workstation that more than one user works on, why, then they'll all see that printer queue. Click Apply, and it tells us that the printer deployment or removal operation succeeded. Simple as that. That's all there is to it. And then to see what you've deployed, you can just come down to the Deployed Printers filter and change up your policy settings. To complete this nugget, let's look at group policy management of printer behavior and metadata. You see how easy it is to deploy printers themselves in group policy. Let us now pop open the group policy management console. This time I'm going to edit our default domain policy, and under computer configuration, policies, administrative templates, printers, we have a number of really useful group policies that deal with putting boundaries on what users can or cannot do, as well as things that can speed up administration of printers, automatically publish new printers in Active Directory, allow pruning of published printers, computer location options, point and print restrictions. This is going to limit potentially which servers or which print queues users can just use that drag and drop point and print feature to install their own drivers. That's something else with Windows 7. You do not have to be a computer administrator to install a print queue by default. I think we've covered the major aspects of printing and network printing and how to manage and troubleshoot that stuff both on the server side as well as the client side. Administering network printer issues review. In this nugget, we began with a discussion of printing in general in Windows 7 and how that's advanced since previous versions of Windows OS. We examined printer hardware, the difference between a print device and a printer, various reasons for printer hardware failure, the rollers or the inner mechanism getting all gummed up, paper jams, etc. However, the lion's share of this nugget was consumed with how to actually set up, deploy, and maintain printers in Windows 7, as well as here on the server side. Remember, it's important for us to have a holistic understanding of not just what the client sees at their desktop, or what the user sees, I should say, but also is what's happening back on the server side. We finished with looking at some advances in Windows 7 and Server 08 R2 in terms of making driver, network, and printer queue management easier for administrators and for our users. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.
American dream.